The dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m., and the silver sedan moved through the dark belly of Route 9 like a quiet thought no one had finished thinking. Judge Renata Ashford sat behind the wheel with one hand resting loosely at the bottom of the steering column, her other elbow propped against the door, fingers pressed lightly to her temple. She was exhausted in the particular way that only 3 days of arguing with people who refused to be wrong could produce. The state judicial conference in Hartford had ended that afternoon with the same hollow handshakes and careful smiles that always concluded such gatherings, a performance of collegial unity masking the deep, persistent fault lines running beneath the surface of the court system. Renata had spent the better part of Tuesday morning locked in a heated debate with Judge Lavinia Wentworth, a woman whose silver hair and patrician bearing concealed a philosophy built entirely on the assumption that the machinery of law enforcement was essentially trustworthy and needed only modest refinement. You advocate for defendants as though conviction itself is the injustice, Wentworth had said across the conference table, her reading glasses perched at the end of her nose, her voice carrying the gentle condescension of someone who has never needed to question which side of the system they would find themselves on. A judge's role is to apply the law, Renata, not to compensate for perceived sociological inequity. Renata had taken a long breath before answering. She had learned over 2 decades on the bench and before it that certain conversations required patience, the way surgery required a steady hand. You did not rush. You did not let emotion make the incision. The law and its application are 2 different things, Lavinia, she had said. I've seen what happens when officers operate without accountability. I've sat across from young men who were in the wrong place, wearing the wrong clothing, and left those meetings with criminal records that followed them for the rest of their lives. That is not a sociological abstraction. That is a systemic pattern. Wentworth had smiled the thin, tolerant smile of someone who considers the conversation already settled. Renata thought about that smile now, watching the dark tree line scroll past her windows. She reached up and pulled the band from her hair, letting it fall loose around her shoulders. She was wearing an oversized gray university hoodie, worn black yoga pants, and a pair of scuffed running shoes that she had owned for 4 years and could not bring herself to replace. Her judicial robes were folded in the garment bag on the back seat. Tonight, she was not the Honorable Judge Ashford. Tonight, she was just a tired woman trying to get home. She had not always been the Honorable Judge Ashford. For 12 years before she took the bench, she had been Renata Ashford, Public Defender, a small brass placard on a shared office door in a building that smelled permanently of old coffee and institutional carpet cleaner. She had represented men and women who could not afford the lawyers who would have saved them, who sat in holding cells, while their cases moved through the system at the pace of a bureaucracy that had never been designed to move quickly for people without money. She had learned the courtroom from the floor, not the bench from the side, where the stakes were real and the margin for error was measured in years of a human life. She still carried a small leather notebook in her purse. In it, written in her precise, narrow handwriting, were the names of the clients she remembered most clearly. Marcus Webb, 19 years old, held for 11 hours on a loitering charge before she got him out. Tiara Holland stopped while walking home from a night shift, handcuffed in front of her 7-year-old daughter for reasons that no officer had been able to coherently articulate in the subsequent review. Wendell Greer, 41 at the time, a maintenance supervisor with a spotless work record, arrested after a traffic stop on the east side of Oak Falls, charged with resisting the charge that appeared on Brackett's reports, the way a magician produces a coin reliably and without explanation. She had gotten Wendell's charges dropped. It had taken 4 months and cost him his job anyway. The fuel warning chimed. A small amber light pulsed on the dashboard with the patient insistence of something that had been waiting for her attention for several miles. Renata exhaled and scanned the roadside. The highway through this stretch of Oak Falls County was poorly lit and largely commercial, the kind of corridor that existed to connect other places rather than to be a place itself. A gas station sign appeared ahead, the red Texaco star glowing faintly above a lot of cracked concrete and flickering fluorescence. She coasted off the highway and pulled up to the pump. The station was completely empty. The overhead lights buzzed and stuttered, casting the lot in a sickly yellow glow that made everything look slightly wrong, like a photograph taken under bad conditions. Renata stepped out into the cold night air, feeling it bite at the exposed skin of her wrists and cheeks. She swiped her credit card, lifted the nozzle, and listened to the low mechanical clicking of the pump as fuel moved into her tank. The silence around her was total except for that sound and the distant moan of a truck somewhere on the highway. She heard the engine before she saw the vehicle. A heavy, low rumble, the particular idol of a V8 that has been driven hard and often. White and green, the Oak Falls County Sheriff's cruiser rolled slowly into the station lot, its headlights sweeping across her sedan. Renata watched it from the corner of her eye without turning her head. The cruiser did not pull toward any of the pumps. Instead, it circled the lot in a slow, deliberate arc and then jerked to a stop at a sharp angle that blocked the nose of her car from pulling forward. Two officers stepped out. The one from the driver's side was broad, square, shouldered late 30s, with a buzz cut that was growing out unevenly and an expression that had clearly not entertained doubt in some years. He moved with the particular swagger of a man who had been told repeatedly and by people with authority over him that his instincts were reliable. His name tag read Breckett, his partner younger by a decade, with the slightly pale look of someone still accumulating the necessary calluses for this line of work, hung back a half step. His tag read Alderton. "Evening," said Breckett, his voice carrying the lacquered surface of forced politeness over a core of something considerably less pleasant. "Good evening, officers," Renata replied. Her tone was even unhurried. Years of demanding order in chaotic courtrooms had given her a voice that did not betray the interior calculations already running at speed. She turned back to the pump. "Bit late to be out on this stretch," Breckett said. He moved closer, not toward the pump, toward her. "Where you headed?" "Home," Renata said. "Just need to finish filling up." "Home where?" He stepped into her peripheral space close enough that she could smell stale coffee and the faint chemical bite of chewing tobacco on his uniform. His gaze moved over her clothes, her shoes, her car, performing an inventory drawing conclusions. "The city," she said. "Which part of the city?" Renata set the nozzle back into its cradle with a small, deliberate click and turned to face him fully. This was not a consensual conversation anymore. This was something that had a legal category and a trajectory she recognized. "Officer Breckett," she said, his name read calmly from the tag on his chest. "Am I suspected of committing a crime?" A beat. Something shifted in his eyes. The performance of politeness dropped by a degree. "We've had reports of break-ins in the residential area a few miles back," he said. "You match the description." It was a lie. She knew it was a lie because she had driven this highway with her scanner application running a habit from years of late judicial drives, and the channel had been quiet for the last 40 minutes. No dispatch calls, no reported incidents. The lie was not particularly inventive, which told her something about how often it had been necessary to be inventive. "I see," she said. "And what does the description state?" "I'd like to see some identification," Breckett said, stepping past her question entirely. Renata looked at him steadily. "Unless you have a reasonable, articulable suspicion that I have committed, am committing, or am about to commit a specific crime, I am not legally required to identify myself while standing at a gas pump. That is the law of this state, officer." The flush moved up his neck before it reached his face. It was the particular color of an ego bruised publicly, the red of a man unaccustomed to being told no by someone he had already decided did not have the standing to say it. "Listen to me very carefully," he said, and the pretense of courtesy was entirely gone now. He stepped forward until he was close enough that Renata had to make a conscious choice not to step back. "You are going to produce your ID, and my partner is going to look through your vehicle, or you are going to spend the rest of the night making new friends at the county precinct. I do not consent to a search of my vehicle." Renata said, her voice quieter now, which in her experience carried further than volume in a confrontation. "And if you continue to detain me without lawful cause, you are violating my Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure. I am telling you this clearly and calmly, officer, because I want to make sure we both understand what is happening here." Behind Breckett, Alderton shifted his weight. He looked at his partner, then at Renata, then at the empty lot around them. "Holden," Alderton said quietly, low enough that he likely hoped only Breckett would hear. "She's not wrong about the law." "Get the cuffs," Breckett said. "Are you sure about this?" "She's not doing anything." "Get the cuffs, Corbin, now." Breckett moved. He stepped forward and grabbed Renata's right wrist with the grip of a man who intended to communicate something beyond the legal mechanics of the arrest. He pulled her arm behind her back in a motion that sent a sharp white pain up through her shoulder and into her neck. "Stop resisting," he said loudly, projecting the words, performing them for the camera mounted on his dashboard. Stop resisting. Renata went completely limp. It was a deliberate choice made in the half second between the grab and the pain, registering a choice born from 12 years of coaching clients on exactly this scenario. Do not give them anything they can describe as resistance. Do not give them footage they can edit. I am not resisting, she said, and she said it clearly aimed at the small microphone clipped to his lapel, ensuring every word was captured in a form that could not be disputed. I am complying. You are conducting an unlawful arrest. Shut up, Beckett said, and then he turned her and pressed her face forward into the trunk of her own car. The cold metal of the trunk contacted her cheek with a shock that traveled through her teeth and behind her eyes. She heard Alderton approach, the sound of handcuffs being unclipped, and then the cold steel closing around one wrist, then the other. Holden, Alderton said again, something tight and frightened in his voice now. Beckett ignored him. He took the cuffs from Alderton's hands and cinched them down one more notch than necessary, and Renata felt the steel bite into the thin skin of her inner wrists, felt the circulation to her fingers begin to slow. She said nothing. She cataloged it. She filed it in the precise mental archive she had been building since the moment the cruiser circled the lot. They put her in the back seat. The hard plastic bench offered nothing for her arms pinned behind her, and the angle made the cuffs press harder with every movement. Through the wire partition, she watched Beckett settle into the driver's seat, heard him laugh at something Alderton said, a high giddy sound, the adrenaline of a man who had just exercised power and felt it confirm everything he believed about himself. Thinks she learns her constitutional law from television, Beckett said, checking the rearview mirror. He found her eyes in the reflection. Let's see how smart you feel after a few hours in a concrete box. Renata looked out the window at the dark highway. She was not thinking about the cold or the pain in her wrists or the indignity of the hard plastic seat. She was thinking about Deputy Holden Beckett's file, which she was nearly certain she had seen cross her desk at some point in the previous 3 years. She was thinking about 14 internal complaints and a captain named Gareth Colburn who had stood between each of those complaints and their consequences like a man protecting an investment. She was thinking about Wendell Greer's name in her notebook. And she was thinking about the camera on Beckett's dashboard, the one she had watched record the entire encounter, while Beckett apparently believed it was off. He was wrong. The Oak Falls County precinct was fluorescent and tired at midnight, the kind of institutional space that had absorbed decades of human misery into its walls and offered nothing back. Sergeant Thad Dunbar was at the desk when they brought her in, a heavy-set man with the specific expression of someone who had processed too many bookings to be surprised by anything. He looked at Renata, at her hoodie and yoga pants and scuffed shoes, and pulled a form from the tray. What are we looking at, Beckett? Disorderly resisting refusal to identify. Possible suspect in the Oakwood break-ins. Beckett deposited this inventory with the casual confidence of a man filing paperwork. Dunbar looked at Renata. Name? Renata Ashford. He typed. Address. She gave it. The address of a property in a gated residential enclave in the neighboring district, a neighborhood Dunbar would have associated had he been paying closer attention with a particular income bracket that did not typically end up in booking at midnight. He was not paying closer attention. He was tired. He stamped the form. Her personal effects were collected in a manila envelope, phone keys, the small leather note, book, and her wallet. Beckett tossed the wallet into the envelope without opening it, without seeing the silver judicial badge or the State Bar Association card or the credit card printed with the honorific that preceded her name. He tossed it in. The flap was sealed. It was set on a shelf. Dunbar directed an officer to take her to holding cell 3. The cell was small, cold, and lit by a single fluorescent tube behind a wire cage. The metal bench was narrow and rigid. The door closed behind her with a sound that she knew in that moment it would never again be merely the sound of a door closing. She had heard that sound from the other side of the glass in interview rooms. She had heard it described by clients in the measured, careful language of people trying to communicate something that language was not designed to hold. She had never heard it from the inside. She sat on the metal bench and rubbed her wrists. The red welts were already rising, the flesh tender and beginning to mottle purple at the pressure points where the steel had bitten deepest. She pressed her thumb against one mark and held the pressure not from pain, but from need, as though contact with the evidence would help her retain clarity about what had happened and what it meant. She thought about Marcus Webb, 19 years old, sitting in a cell in Hartford, while she had worked the phones at 11 at night, trying to get him out before morning. She thought about Tierra Hollins handcuffed on a sidewalk, her daughter watching. She thought about Wendell Greer, who had lost his job, his apartment, and 2 years of his life to a charge that had dissolved the moment it received proper legal scrutiny. She thought about all of them, every name in the notebook, and for the first time she understood not just intellectually, but physically and completely what those nights had cost them. The cold, the helplessness, the total absolute surrender of agency to a system that was moving without you and would continue to move without you, regardless of whether what it was doing was right. A righteous icy fire settled into her chest. She was not going to spend this night in fear. She was going to spend it building a case. She knew exactly what tomorrow held. The Oak Falls County District Courthouse, her courthouse was on her docket for the morning. She had presided over that building for 11 years. She knew its rhythms and its personnel and the names of every bailiff and court reporter who moved through its corridors. And she knew from the case file she had reviewed the previous week that 2 Oak Falls County Sheriff's deputies were scheduled to appear as witnesses in a motion to suppress evidentiary hearing. She had reviewed the names. Breckett, Alderton. The fire in her chest did not flare. It simply burned steady and controlled and very, very patient. She would not announce who she was. Not to Dunbar, not to the captain when he arrived, not to anyone in this building tonight. Because if she played that card now, they would apologize and backtrack, and Breckett would return to his cruiser and Route 9, and the pattern that had produced 14 complaints, and Wendell Greer's ruined year, and God only knew how many other names that had never made it into any notebook. He needed to walk into courtroom 302 tomorrow morning believing he had won. He needed to be comfortable. He needed to believe that the woman in the oversized hoodie had simply disappeared into the system the way people without power disappeared quietly and without consequence. She sat in the cold and she waited and she planned, and the hours moved slowly the way hours do when you are not afraid of them. Shortly after 6 in the morning, the door at the end of the cell block opened. Footsteps in the corridor. A young woman appeared at the bars of cell 3, clipboard in hand, a morning officer doing inventory of overnight holds. And she looked down at the form on her board, and then up at Renata, and then the color evacuated her face with a completeness that would have been almost comic under different circumstances. "Oh my God," the officer whispered. Her name was Bryn Pemberton, and she had been on the morning shift for 7 months, and she had just opened a manila evidence envelope and looked at the ID inside. She fumbled with the keys, the lock turned, the door swung open. "Judge Ashford," Pemberton's voice was barely functional. "Your husband is here. He posted bail. I am so sorry there has been a massive misunderstanding and the watch commander is on his way down right now. And the captain is being notified this very moment, and I am so sorry, Your Honor. I am so sorry." Renata stood up from the metal bench. Her joints were stiff from the cold and the rigid surface and the hours of sitting with her arms at an unnatural angle. She smoothed the front of her hoodie with a deliberate, unhurried motion. "Officer Pemberton," she said, "I would like my personal effects returned to me immediately." "Yes, ma'am, right this way." The booking area had been transformed. The sleepy midnight bureaucracy was gone, replaced by a controlled panic that had the quality of a building in which someone had pulled a fire alarm. Sergeant Dunbar was standing so straight, his spine looked architectural. Captain Gareth Colburn, a man Renata recognized from departmental proceedings, was still buttoning the collar of his uniform as he came hurrying out of an office, his face the color of old concrete. Breckett and Alderton were nowhere. Their shift had ended at 6. They had gone home to sleep. Declan Ashford was in the lobby, his overcoat thrown over a charcoal suit that told Renata he had not been to bed. He was pacing with the focused energy of a man who had spent the last several hours deciding where to aim a great deal of controlled fury. When he saw her, he crossed the lobby in 4 strides and put his coat around her shoulders. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low. His eyes moving to her wrists, and the muscle in his jaw tightened in a way that told her the corporate litigator in him was assembling a complaint the size of a building. "I'm fine," she said. She let herself lean against him for exactly 3 seconds. Then she straightened and turned to face the captain. "Your Honor." Colburn began, his hands rising in the universal gesture of a man trying to slow something that has already left. "If we had known who you were, this would never have." "I know," Renata said, and the 2 words were calm and precise, and carried within them an entire argument that Colburn apparently understood because he stopped speaking. "That is exactly the point." She looked at him for a moment. She looked at Dunbar. She looked at the room. "Please make sure that Deputies Breckett and Alderton are on time for their appearance in my courtroom this morning," she said. I have an evidentiary hearing that begins at 9. I despise tardiness. She walked through the glass doors into the pale, cold light of the early morning. Behind her, Captain Gareth Colburn stood in the lobby of his own precinct and experienced for the first time in 8 years of running interference for a deputy he should have disciplined the specific sensation of a floor dropping away beneath his feet. He picked up his phone. He needed to make a call. He needed to warn them. He was already too late. The ride to the Oak Falls County precinct was long enough to be its own kind of punishment. The hard plastic bench of the cruiser offered no accommodation for arms pinned at an unnatural angle, and the cuffs tightened beyond the point of necessity worked on the circulation to Renata's fingers until they had moved through cold to something approaching absence. She sat with her back straight and her face neutral, and she watched the passing streetlights through the barred window, and she felt, beneath the pain and the indignity, something that would take her a while to correctly identify gratitude. Not for what was happening, for what it was teaching her in the body, which is the only place some lessons can be taught. She had read the statistics. She knew the research on pretextual stops on the disproportionate application of discretionary police authority across lines of race and perceived economic status on the gap between the theoretical protections of the law and the practical experience of encountering an officer who has decided before he has reached your window what category you belong to. She had written rulings that engaged with these realities. She had believed herself to understand them. She was learning in a back seat on a dark highway the difference between understanding a thing and having felt it. The precinct building appeared at the end of a commercial block, its parking lot lit by harsh sodium lights that made the white patrol vehicles look slightly blue. Beckett pulled in with the ease of a man returning to his natural habitat. In the front seat, the conversation between him and Alderton had run dry several miles back. Alderton had gone quiet in the way of a person who was keeping their thoughts close, and Beckett had misread the silence as agreement. Inside, the booking procedure was brief and impersonal. Sergeant Dunbar processed paperwork with the efficiency of long habit, asking questions and recording answers without looking up from the keyboard for long enough to actually look at Renata as a person, rather than a form to be completed. The manila envelope received her belongings. The wallet went in last without a glance inside, and in the wallet, behind the credit card and the bar association card, and the small photograph of Declan that she had carried since the year they married, was the silver judicial badge and the identification card that said, in clear type, Honorable Renata Ashford, Oak Falls County District Court. It sat in the envelope. The envelope sat on the shelf. Nobody looked. They walked her down a hallway that smelled of institutional cleaning products and the particular staleness of a building that processes human beings through difficulty and exhaustion around the clock. The holding cell was at the end. The door was steel with a narrow window of reinforced glass. The lock engaged with a sound that Renata would not forget. What she had not anticipated was the quality of the silence. She had expected the cold, the hard bench, the institutional fluorescent light behind its cage of wire. What she had not anticipated was what the silence felt like when it was imposed rather than chosen. In her chambers, she worked in silence often, by preference, the specific quiet of concentration and decision. This silence was different. This was the silence of having been removed from the world's reach of being in a space designed to communicate through its every surface, that the person inside it has been temporarily made irrelevant. She understood in that silence why her former clients had described their overnight holds in such careful, controlled language. Not because the physical conditions were necessarily brutal, though they were uncomfortable, but because the experience of irrelevance, of having been sorted into a category that permitted your temporary disappearance from the life you had been living, was a thing that language was not well designed to carry. You either understood it or you had not experienced it. And the gap between those two states was wider than she had known. She sat on the metal bench. She rubbed her wrists. She built a case in her mind, and she kept her breathing even, and she waited with the patience of a person who knows that the morning is coming. The morning sun came through the cheap vinyl blinds of Holden Beckett's apartment in thin, indifferent strips, laying pale lines across the coffee table, the couch, the uniform hanging on the back of the bedroom door. He sat at his kitchen counter in a white undershirt and sweatpants, his thick hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee and he felt as he often felt in the early morning hours before the machinery of the day required him to perform anything entirely untouchable. He pulled out his phone, typed a message to Alderton. Hope our favorite gas station lawyer is enjoying her concrete breakfast. See you at the courthouse. He set the phone down and drank his coffee. He thought about the woman at the pump, her calm refusal, the precise way she had cited legal standards as though she had memorized them from a textbook, and he felt the satisfaction of a man who believes the world has been restored to its correct order. People who argued with officers in parking lots ended up in holding cells. That was how things worked. That was how they were supposed to work. He had no idea that the text message sitting in his phone would within 6 weeks be entered into federal evidence. Across town in a master bathroom tiled in white marble, Renata Ashford stood at the mirror and looked at her wrists. The bruising had deepened overnight from red to a mottled, ugly purple that wrapped both wrists like the impression of a decision someone else had made about her body. She ran her thumb along the mark on the left wrist, pressing into the tenderness with the measured attention of a woman collecting evidence from herself. The marks were clear and symmetrical. The precise width of standard-issue law enforcement restraints applied beyond necessary pressure. She had seen photographs like this in case files. She had written rulings based on photographs like this. She had never been the person in the photograph. Declan appeared in the doorway dressed and knotting his tie, his movements carrying the forced deliberateness of a man keeping himself under control. Let Judge Harwick take the docket, he said. You were assaulted. You have every right to step back. Renata reached for the velvet hanger on the back of the door and lifted the black judicial robe from it. If I step back, she said, sliding her right arm into the wide sleeve, they walk into that courtroom this morning feeling like kings. They spend the weekend telling their colleagues about the mouthy woman they straightened out at the gas station. They come back Monday with the lesson confirmed that this is how it works, and it has always worked, and it will keep working. She drew the robe up over her shoulders. The heavy black fabric settled around her, covering the bruised wrist completely. She looked into the mirror. Today, she said, they come to me. She did not say it with heat. She said it the way she said everything from the bench, with the specific gravity of a decision that has already been made and requires no further deliberation. Declan looked at her reflection. He recognized the face in the mirror. It was not the face of his wife angry. It was the face of his wife certain. Those were different things, and he had learned over 22 years that one of them was negotiable and the other was not. Then I'll be in the gallery, he said. In the corridor outside courtroom 302 at 8:45 in the morning, the Oak Falls County District Courthouse was running at full volume. Lawyers moved between conference rooms with the urgent purposefulness of people who bill by the hour. Families occupied the wooden benches in clusters, some dressed carefully for an occasion they had hoped to avoid, others wearing the exhausted, stripped-down look of people who had been navigating this building for months. The smell of the corridor was institutional recycled air and floor wax, and the faint undercurrent of anxiety that accumulates in places where consequential things happen to people who did not choose for them to. On a wooden bench near the water fountain, a man sat alone. Wendell Greer was 47 years old and wore a clean button-down shirt and dark slacks, the clothes of a man who had dressed carefully for something that mattered to him. He was lean, with the slightly hollowed look of someone who has come through a hard several years and arrived on the other side with the particular economy of a person who has learned to carry only what is necessary. He held a paper coffee cup in both hands and watched the courthouse doors with the patient attention of someone who has learned not to expect things to move quickly. He had read in the local paper that a deputy named Holden Breckett was scheduled to testify in a suppression hearing today. He had taken the bus from the east side of Oak Falls, where he now worked as a building superintendent for a property management company. The job he had found after the arrest had cost him his maintenance supervisor position after his landlord had declined to renew his lease. After the year of suspended existence that followed a charge that was eventually dropped but never in any meaningful practical sense undone, the drop charge did not restore the job. It did not restore the apartment. It did not give back the evening his daughter had watched a deputy sheriff put her father in handcuffs on the front steps of their building while neighbors looked out from their windows. He did not know who the judge was today. He just wanted to see Breckett sit in a witness box and answer for something. Down the corridor, Holden Breckett and Corbin Alderton emerged from the elevator, both in full-dress uniform, both carrying the ease of men arriving for a familiar procedure. Breckett moved through the courthouse with the authority of someone who considers the building his territory as much as anyone else's. He stopped at a drinking fountain, checked his reflection in the black glass of a courtroom door, straightened his badge. He had testified in this building 11 times in the past 6 years. He knew how these hearings worked. Defense attorney raises objections, prosecutor holds the line. Judge validates the stop, everyone goes home. Alderton walked beside him with less of his partner's settled confidence. He had not slept well. The text message Breckett had sent that morning had sat in his phone like a stone, and each time he had thought about responding, he had felt the words dissolve before they could form. There was something wrong about last night that Alderton could not fully articulate, but could not stop feeling. The woman at the pump had been right about the law. He had known it in the moment and said so, and been overruled, and the knowledge had followed him home and kept him awake, and was still sitting behind his eyes this morning like a piece of light he could not look directly at. Their police union representative, Lance Redmond, was waiting outside the heavy oak doors of courtroom 302. He was a compact man in a well-fitted suit with the polished assurance of someone who had spent 20 years navigating the exact territory between what deputies did and what the law permitted them to do. He had represented Breckett on 3 prior complaints and cleared all 3 without formal sanction. "I've reviewed both your affidavits," Redmond said, handing them each a copy. "The core narrative is solid. Furtive movement, non-compliance escalation was justified given the perceived threat level. Judge Ashford runs a tight room, but she were not hostile to law enforcement." He checked his watch. "Answer directly. Don't editorialize. Do not let Blackwood get you talking about your decision-making process in general terms. Stay specific to the night in question." "We know the drill," Breckett said, tucking the affidavit under his arm without reading it. Alderton folded his copy carefully. He read the first paragraph. The affidavit described the woman at the pump as displaying furtive behavior and refusing to comply with a lawful investigation. He remembered her standing at the fuel nozzle, still and steady, citing the law in a voice that carried the precision of someone who had used it before. He refolded the affidavit. They pushed through the oak doors. Courtroom 302 was approximately 2/3 full, the usual morning attendance for a suppression hearing, a handful of legal observers, several defense attorneys waiting on other matters, a court reporter at her station, and Declan Ashford seated in the second row of the gallery with his coat folded in his lap, in an expression of absolute surgical calm. Breckett and Alderton moved down the center aisle and took seats in the front row behind the prosecution table. Breckett leaned back, legs extended, radiating the physical ease of a man who has testified dozens of times and found the experience no more threatening than any other performance. Alderton sat with his hands on his knees, very still. In the corridor outside, Captain Gareth Colburn was running. He had called Breckett twice on the drive over. Neither call had connected. He had then called the courthouse administrator, spoken to a clerk, been put on hold, transferred, put on hold again, and by the time he had confirmed that the morning docket for Judge Ashford had not been reassigned, he was in the parking structure with 30 seconds between himself and what he understood was a structural catastrophe. He had spent 8 years protecting Breckett from the consequences of his own behavior, filing reviews that quietly dismissed complaints, writing assessments that described an officer whose judgment was sound. Every one of those documents was now a liability. He ran through the main entrance, past the security line, holding his badge up without slowing, turned down the corridor toward 302, saw the heavy oak doors, heard the bailiff's voice beginning to rise on the other side. "All rise." Colburn stopped. His hand was on the door handle. He could hear Arthur, the senior bailiff, whose voice had been calling this room to order for 19 years, projecting into the high ceiling space. The District Court of Oak Falls County is now in session. The Honorable Judge Renata Ashford presiding. Colburn released the door handle. He stood in the corridor and he did not go in. He pressed his forehead against the wood of the door and closed his eyes and understood with the complete clarity that arrives too late that there was nothing left for him to manage. He had spent 8 years being the wall between Breckett's actions and their consequences. The wall was gone. He had walked into this courthouse today carrying the weight of every complaint he had buried. And in a few moments, that weight was going to be placed on a public record in a room he did not have the courage to enter. Inside the room, Deputy Holden Breckett rose with everyone else and then sat and then looked up at the bench the way he always looked up at the bench, with the practiced deference of a man who considers the gesture a formality rather than a genuine acknowledgement of authority. He looked at the figure ascending the steps behind the elevated mahogany desk. The heavy black robe, the neat posture, the dark hair pinned back from a face that was composed and unreadable. He knew that face. His brain did not process the information immediately. It came in stages the way a catastrophic structural failure does not happen at once, but in the sequence of small surrenders that together constitute collapse. The recognition moved from the periphery of his awareness to the center of it, and by the time it arrived fully formed, Brackett's hands were gripping the wooden railing in front of him, and the color had left his face in a long, draining wave. The woman from the Texaco station. The woman he had slammed against the trunk of a silver sedan on Route 9 at midnight. The woman he had left in holding cell 3 with over-tightened cuffs in the specific parting thought that she would learn eventually the cost of testing his authority. She was the chief magistrate of the very court he was currently sitting in. Next to him, Alderton made a sound that had no name. A compressed, involuntary vocalization from somewhere in the back of his throat, the sound of a person absorbing information that the body registers before the mind finishes processing it. "Holden," Alderton whispered. "Holden, that's her." Brackett said nothing. He could not produce sound. The architecture of his morning, its comfortable certainty, its ease, had dissolved so completely that he could not locate the part of himself that had 40 minutes ago sent a mocking text message and drunk coffee in an undershirt. "Good morning, counsel," Judge Ashford said from the bench. Her voice carried the specific, measured resonance of someone who has spent years ensuring that every word they speak in a particular space lands exactly where they intend it. She opened the folder on her desk. She arranged her pens. She poured water from a small pitcher into a glass. Each movement was unhurried, precise, and utterly ordinary. She did not look at the front row. "We will begin this morning's docket with the evidentiary hearing on the motion to suppress in the matter of State versus Stanton. The court understands that we are examining the conduct of the arresting officers and the constitutional validity of the stop and subsequent search." She paused. She lifted her gaze from the folder. She looked directly at Holden Brackett. "I see that Deputies Brackett and Alderton are present." Her voice was the formal courtesy of the courtroom, precise and empty of anything that could be named. "Deputy Brackett, please take the stand." The walk from the front row to the witness box was 34 feet. Brackett knew this because he counted each step. His legs moved in the mechanical way of legs operating without clear instruction from the person they belonged to. He pushed through the low swinging gate. He climbed the 2 steps to the witness box. He placed his palm on the Bible, and the palm was wet enough that it left a damp mark on the cover when Arthur pulled the book away. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do," Brackett said. His voice sounded to him like a voice coming from another room. Defense attorney Nolan Blackwood rose from his chair, adjusted his glasses, and approached the witness box with the deliberate calm of a man who has been surprised to find this morning that the terrain has shifted significantly in his favor without his having done anything to cause it. He had spent the drive to the courthouse preparing for a difficult uphill hearing. He was now, for reasons he did not yet fully understand, sensing that the hill had reversed its grade. The judge's posture, the quality of silence in the room, the way the senior court reporter had sat up slightly straighter when Judge Ashford entered, all of it communicated that something was already in motion. "Deputy Brackett, your sworn affidavit states that you forcefully extracted my client from his vehicle because he displayed disorderly behavior and you suspected him of criminal activity. Can you describe for the court the specific articulable facts that led you to that suspicion?" Brackett looked at Redmond. Redmond gave the small, encouraging nod of a man who does not yet understand that the building he is standing in is on fire. "He was in a high-crime area," Brackett said, "and he refused to provide identification when I asked for it." Judge Ashford leaned forward. The movement was subtle, perhaps 3 inches, but it silenced the room in the way that small movements from positions of authority sometimes do when the authority is absolute and everyone in the space understands it. "Deputy Brackett," she said, "you are asserting under oath in this court that a citizen's presence in a particular neighborhood combined with their lawful exercise of the right not to identify themselves in the absence of articulable suspicion constitutes the foundation for physical force and arrest." Brackett's shirt was wet at the collar. "No, Your Honor, I mean he was also resisting." "Resisting what specifically?" She did not raise her voice. She dropped it. a lawful order or an unlawful escalation by an officer who had been given a clear and accurate explanation of what the law actually permitted. At the prosecution table, Petra Halcourt had stopped writing. She set her pen down on the legal pad in front of her with the careful placement of someone putting something down they do not intend to pick back up. Halcourt was a notoriously aggressive prosecutor and a woman of uncompromising professional ethics. She looked at Beckett on the stand and then at the bench. And something in the judge's posture and the precision of her questioning triggered a recognition that made Halcourt's stomach drop. "We followed procedure, Your Honor," Beckett said, and the words came out thin and unconvincing, even to him, as if the sentence understood its own inadequacy. "Standard procedure," Judge Ashford said softly. She raised her hands from beneath the bench and placed them flat on the mahogany surface. The sleeves of her robe settled back. The bruising on both wrists was fully visible under the fluorescent lights, dark and clear, and unmistakable the deep purple of injuries that had been made with deliberate force and had spent a night deepening. The gallery inhaled. Redmond's pen dropped from his hand onto the floor. Halcourt looked at the wrists and then at the deputies and then back at the wrists, and she pushed her chair back from the table, 4 inches, a small physical declaration of distance that every person in the room understood. In the back corner of the gallery, a young journalist named Sable Morse, who had drawn the courthouse assignment that morning with the mild disappointment of someone expecting a routine evidentiary hearing, was no longer mildly disappointed. She was typing into her phone with the speed of a person who understands that they are watching something that will not wait. Beckett stared at the bruises. He recognized them. He had made them, had tightened the steel that made them, and now they were displayed under courthouse lights in front of every person in this room as cleanly and irrefutably as any piece of evidence entered into the official record. "Deputy Beckett," Judge Ashford said, and her voice dropped to the register she used when she had finished the preliminary work and arrived at the point. "I am going to present a series of hypothetical scenarios for the purposes of establishing your understanding of constitutional law and proper procedure." She began. Each hypothetical was a mirror held up to the previous night. A citizen standing at a gas pump late at night alone wearing casual clothing, engaged in no observable illegal activity. An officer approaches and demands identification, citing a vague and unverified report of criminal activity in the general area. The citizen, knowing their rights accurately, explains that they are not required to identify themselves without articulable suspicion of a specific crime. The officer escalates. The officer grabs the citizen. The officer forces the citizen's face against the surface of a vehicle. Beckett answered each element. He could not do otherwise. The alternative to answering truthfully was to perjure himself in front of the woman he had assaulted, and perjury compounded what was already sitting on the bench, looking at him with the unreadable patience of someone who had planned every word of this conversation from a concrete cell the night before. With each answer, Beckett confirmed what every person in the room was understanding in real time. The hypothetical officer had no legal basis for the stop. The hypothetical officer had fabricated a pretext. The hypothetical officer's use of physical force constituted assault against a citizen, exercising constitutionally protected rights. Redmond stood. "Objection, Your Honor. This line of hypothetical questioning has no relevance to the matter before the court today." Judge Ashford's head turned toward Redmond with a precision that stopped him mid-sentence. "Mr. Redmond," she said, "you are present in this room as union representation, not as counsel of record. If you interrupt these proceedings again, Bailiff Arthur will escort you to a holding cell." She held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary. "I am extremely familiar with what a holding cell involves, Mr. Redmond. Are you—" Redmond sat down. Alderton was trembling. It had started in his hands a fine, high-frequency shaking that he could not control, and it had moved up through his arms and into his chest, and now his entire body was vibrating with the kind of fear that does not respect professional training or the presence of witnesses. He looked at Beckett on the stand. He looked at the bruises on the judge's wrists. He thought about the text message he had received that morning. He thought about the moment at the pump when he had said, "Holden, she's not wrong about the law," and Beckett had said, "Get the cuffs." He thought about the moment when Beckett had taken the handcuffs from his own hands and cinched them tighter one more notch with the particular deliberateness of a man making a point. Alderton stood up. His chair scraped the polished hardwood with a sound that cut through every other sound in the room. Redmond grabbed at his arm. Alderton pulled free. Your Honor, Alderton said, and his voice came out in pieces cracked at the seams, barely cohesive. Please. He was shaking visibly. I told him. At the pump, I told him she was right about the law. I asked him if he was sure. I didn't want to put the cuffs on. He made me. He said she was a nobody. The word landed in the courtroom. Nobody. The room was absolutely still. Judge Ashford looked at Alderton. Her expression had not changed. It was the same composed, unreadable judicial mask it had been since she entered. And yet something in her eyes shifted, something too small and too controlled to be called emotion. But that Declan, watching from the second row, recognized immediately as the thing his wife felt when she understood something at a level that went below the legal and arrived at the human. Deputy Alderton, Judge Ashford said with a quietness that was somehow total. You will sit down. You will not speak unless directed to. And as an officer of this court, I am advising you that you have in this moment made spontaneous statements that may constitute an admission to a felony. I strongly recommend you exercise your Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination before you say anything further. Alderton looked at her. He looked at the woman he had helped put in a holding cell, who was now sitting on the bench of her own courtroom and using her authority to protect his constitutional rights. The profound distance between what she was and what they had done to her collapsed in on him all at once. He sat down, he pressed his hands over his face. His shoulders moved. Redmond stared at the side of Alderton's head with the expression of a man watching something irreplaceable fall off a shelf in slow motion. At the prosecution table, Petra Halcourt stood up. She straightened her jacket. She looked at the bench. She looked at Beckett in the witness box, at the sweat on his face and the bone-white grip of his hands on the wooden railing. She looked at the bruises on Judge Ashford's wrists. She had spent 14 years as a prosecutor, believing that her work required the reliability of law enforcement testimony as its foundation. She was looking at the person who had provided that testimony, and she was looking at what he had done, and she understood that the foundation under this particular case was not cracked. It was absent. Your Honor, Halcourt said, her voice steady and deliberate, aimed at the court reporter's transcription as much as at the bench. The state relies on the integrity of its law enforcement witnesses to pursue justice. In light of the testimony presented this morning, the physical evidence currently visible to this court, and the spontaneous statement just made by Deputy Alderton, the state finds it cannot in good conscience continue to treat either deputy as a credible witness. We are withdrawing both deputies from any further role in this proceeding. She turned toward Beckett. The look she gave him contained no sympathy and nothing personal. It was the look of someone who has identified the source of contamination and is moving to contain it. Furthermore, Halcourt continued, turning back to the bench. Given that the arrest of the defendant in this matter rests entirely on the sworn testimony of these two individuals, the state is joining the defense's motion to dismiss. Blackwood was already on his feet. The defense moves to dismiss all charges against Calvin Stanton with prejudice, Your Honor. The state joins, Halcourt said. Judge Ashford looked at the folder on her desk. She looked at the two lawyers before her. She looked briefly at the young man seated next to Blackwood, Calvin Stanton, 24 years old, who had been facing years in a state facility on the strength of a police report that was now publicly confirmed as the product of the same operational ethics currently on display in this courtroom. The motion is granted, Judge Ashford said. All charges against the defendant are dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Stanton, you are free to go. Stanton put his head down on the table. His shoulders shook with the release of something that had been building for months. Bailiff Arthur, Judge Ashford said. Arthur stepped forward. Please secure the main doors. No one leaves this room. Arthur walked to the back of the gallery. The heavy brass deadbolts turned. The metallic sound echoed back through the silent courtroom, and Holden Beckett, who was still sitting in the witness box, heard in that sound something he recognized from a distance of 7 hours. It was the sound of a door closing with finality from the outside. Judge Ashford rose from her chair. She did not step down from the elevated bench. She stood at its full height and looked out over the room, and the room looked back, and nobody in it made a sound. The power granted to law enforcement by this state, she said, is not an entitlement. It is a trust, a specific heavy conditional trust extended by the public to individuals who have sworn an oath to exercise it with restraint, with judgment, and with respect for the rights of every citizen they encounter. Not some citizens, every citizen. She placed her hands flat on the mahogany surface. The bruises were visible. She did not call attention to them. They were simply there, part of the visual record of the morning. Last night, deputies Breckett and Alderton violated that trust. They approached a citizen engaged in no illegal activity, and when that citizen accurately described the limits of their lawful authority, they responded with force. They did this because they believed the citizen was powerless. She paused. They were wrong about that. From the back of the courtroom, a sharp, authoritative knock fell on the secured oak doors. Arthur looked at the bench. Judge Ashford gave a single measured nod. Arthur unlocked the deadbolts and pulled the doors open. 4 men entered. They came down the center aisle with the focused deliberateness of people who have a specific reason for being in a specific place and have prepared for it. Leading them was Brennan Foxworth, chief investigator for the state attorney general's office. Behind him, 2 state troopers. And trailing at the rear, his uniform collar damp his face, carrying the color of a man who has recently understood the dimensions of a disaster he helped construct, Captain Gareth Colburn. Breckett watched them come. He watched Colburn. Colburn did not look at him. That was the moment Breckett understood completely. The man who had blocked 14 complaints, who had written the procedural assessments that cleared each one, who had been the administrative architecture between Breckett's behavior and its consequences, was not here to help him. Colburn was here because Foxworth had brought him, and Foxworth had brought him because Colburn was part of what needed to be dismantled. Foxworth stopped at the swinging gate to the well of the court. "With the court's permission, Your Honor." "Proceed, Investigator Foxworth." Foxworth pushed through the gate. He walked directly to the witness stand. He looked at Breckett with the particular professional contempt reserved for officers who have given other officers reasons to be ashamed. "Deputy Holden Breckett, you are hereby relieved of duty effective immediately pending criminal investigation by the Office of the State Attorney General in coordination with federal authorities. You are under investigation for violation of Title 18 United States Code, Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. Additionally, for false arrest, falsification of official records, and aggravated assault." He turned. He pointed at Alderton. "The same applies to Deputy Alderton." Then Foxworth turned back, and he looked not at the deputies but at Colburn, who was standing at the edge of the well, and he spoke the words Colburn had spent 8 years hoping he would never hear. "Captain Colburn, you are also hereby placed on administrative leave pending a criminal investigation into your systematic obstruction of official misconduct proceedings. The documentation recovered from departmental files indicates a pattern of interference spanning 8 years and 14 separate complaints. The Attorney General's office will be in contact with your attorney." Colburn had known this was coming from the moment he had read the name on the booking sheet that morning. But hearing it said aloud in this room in front of the woman whose wrists bore the evidence of the system he had enabled removed whatever distance had remained between him and the full weight of what he had done. He said nothing. He simply stood very still and looked at a point on the floor. "Please," Breckett said. The word came out small and wrong, stripped of every quality it would have needed to carry weight in this room. "Brennan, come on, I have a wife. I have a pension." His voice was cracking at the edges. It was a misunderstanding. Foxworth did not respond to this. He reached forward and unpinned the silver Oak Falls County Sheriff's star from Breckett's chest. The pin snapped free with a small, clean sound that carried to every corner of the room. Foxworth set the badge on the defense table. He unholstered Breckett's duty weapon, set it down. The taser, the radio, each one placed with the deliberate care of someone restoring stolen property to its rightful context. The state troopers moved to Alderton and performed the same systematic unburdening. Stripped of badge, weapon, radio, and the professional identity those objects had constituted, Breckett and Alderton looked diminished in a way that was not about physical size. They looked like men who have been carrying a story about themselves for a long time and have just had it taken away. The troopers took them by the arms. They walked them down the center aisle toward the oak doors, past the gallery, past Declan Ashford in the second row, past Sable Morris in the corner, who was still typing. At the doors, Breckett stopped. He looked back over his shoulder up at the bench. Judge Renata Ashford stood there in her black robe, motionless, watching him go. There was no satisfaction visible in her expression. No victory, only the same composed, precise, judicial steadiness she had maintained since she entered the room. She had come here to do a job. She had done it. Breckett turned away. The troopers moved him through the doors. Judge Ashford reached for the gavel. "This court is in recess." The sound of wood on wood rang through the room and did not stop ringing for a long time. The courthouse corridor had that particular quality of the minutes just after something irreversible. The crowd from the gallery moved with the slightly dazed forward momentum of people who have been in a room where something they did not expect to witness has just occurred and who are still in the process of understanding what it means. Sable Morse walked quickly toward the elevator phone already to her ear. A young paralegal who had been waiting on a different matter stood near the water fountain and looked at his senior attorney with an expression that asked whether what he had just seen was as significant as it felt. The senior attorney's expression confirmed that it was. In the corridor outside the sealed oak doors, Captain Gareth Colburn had remained after the troopers walked Beckett and Alderton out. He stood alone now in the cleared space between the doors and the nearest bench, and the quality of his stillness was different from the stillness of a man who is composed. It was the stillness of a man who has reached the end of a long forward motion and does not know what direction comes next. 8 years. He had spent 8 years being the administrative buffer between Holden Beckett and consequence. He had written the language that made 14 complaints disappear into the filing system without leaving a mark. He had told himself during those 8 years that he was managing the complexity of real police work, that Beckett was effective in the field, that the complaints were the predictable friction of an officer willing to make hard decisions in difficult circumstances. He had told himself this so many times and with such consistency that it had acquired the texture of something he believed rather than something he had constructed. Standing in the corridor of a courthouse with a federal investigator's warning still in the air, the construction was visible for what it was. He had known each of the 14 times that what he was filing was not the truth of what had happened. He had known and he had filed it anyway, and now the sum of those decisions was a number that federal prosecutors would spend the next several months converting into charges. He sat down on the bench near the water fountain. He sat there for a long time. Inside courtroom 302, before the bailiff released the remaining gallery, Brennan Foxworth approached the bench one final time. He had one more piece of information he had been holding until the formal proceedings were concluded. "Your Honor," Foxworth said quietly, so that the exchange would not carry to the few remaining observers. "I want you to know that the department's Internal Affairs Division has been cooperating fully since this morning. In addition to the 14 documented complaints, investigators have identified 3 additional cases that appear to match the pattern described by Deputy Alderton. The families involved are being notified today." Judge Ashford looked at Foxworth steadily. 3 more. "Yes, the documentation in those files shows the same alterations, the same signature on the revised reviews." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Make sure those families have access to whatever resources your office can direct their way." "We will." She nodded once. Foxworth stepped back. She collected her folder and her notes and descended the steps of the bench. Across town in a waiting room at a legal aid clinic on Bridgeport Street, a woman named Tiara Hollins sat in a plastic chair and read a text message from a number she did not recognize. The text informed her that the investigation of the officer involved in her 2019 arrest had produced new evidence, and that a victim's advocate from the State Attorney General's office would be reaching out to discuss available remedies. Tiara Hollins read the message twice. She had stopped expecting anything from that case 3 years ago. She looked at the message a third time and set her phone face down on her knee and sat very still for a moment before she looked up at the room around her, the same clinic where she had met her public defender years before, and allowed herself to feel the specific complicated relief of a person who has been told that they were not forgotten after all. The public defender who had represented her then was sitting in a corridor on the other side of the county in a black judicial robe, about to have lunch with her husband before returning to the bench. Wendell Greerisher on the bench near the water fountain outside courtroom 302 finally stood up when the last of the morning's crowd had cleared. He folded his paper cup, dropped it in the trash can beside the fountain, straightened his shirt. He had ridden the bus out here without certainty of what he would find, and he was riding it back with something he had not had when he boarded that morning. Not resolution, not the erasure of what had happened, but the specific, modest, real weight of having been in a room where the accounting was conducted and the ledger, at least in this case, was no longer blank. He walked toward the elevator. He passed the bench where Captain Colburn was still sitting, and Colburn looked up, and for a moment they looked at each other. Man who had blocked 14 complaints and the man who was one of those 14, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. that the morning had not already set more completely than either of them could manage. Wendell went to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. The doors closed. The courthouse corridor outside courtroom 302 emptied in the manner of a place where something large has just finished happening. Lawyers gathered in clusters of 2 and 3, speaking in low, rapid voices. The court reporter came out with her machine under her arm, moving with purpose toward the transcript office. A young public defender, who had been observing the hearing from the back row, stood near the elevator with his notepad held against his chest, and a look on his face like a man who has just witnessed something he will spend years trying to accurately describe. Wendell Greer sat on the wooden bench near the water fountain and watched them all pass. He had heard the sounds from inside the courtroom throughout the hearing, the rise and fall of voices, the particular resonance of authority being exercised in a high-ceiling space. And he had understood from those sounds alone that something significant had happened even before the doors opened and the gallery began to move. He had seen the state troopers emerge first, their posture professional and deliberate. He had seen the 2 men in uniform being walked out behind them. Stripped of the equipment on their belts, their posture altered in a way that could not be disguised or explained away. One of them was Beckett. Wendell recognized the face. The broad set of the shoulders, the buzz cut growing out at the temples. 6 years older, but the same. The same man who had stepped out of a cruiser on the east side of Oak Falls on a Tuesday evening and turned Wendell's ordinary life into something that took 3 years to partially reassemble. He had never forgotten that face. He had never been able to decide in the 6 years since whether the inability to forget was a burden or a form of witness. Perhaps it was both. Beckett did not look at the benches as he was walked out. He looked at the floor. Then the doors opened wider and the gallery continued to empty, and Wendell looked past the movement and saw a woman in a black judicial robe standing in the corridor just outside the courtroom entrance, speaking quietly to a tall man in a charcoal suit. Wendell recognized her the way you recognize a voice from another decade incompletely. At first, the face wrong in his memory because he had last seen it across a conference table in a legal aid office on Bridgeport Street. Younger and without the authority, the black robe now communicated. She had been in her mid-30s then, in a blazer that had been pressed carefully despite the tired edges of a public defender's salary. And she had sat across from him and said with absolute conviction that the charges would not survive scrutiny and that she would not stop until they were gone. It had taken 4 months, but she had been right. The eyes were the same. The composed attention was the same. She looked up from the conversation and she saw him. 12 feet of corridor between them, the courthouse still moving and noisy around them both. Wendell did not move, and Judge Ashford did not move, and for a long moment they looked at each other across the distance of 6 years and all that those years had contained. The apartment, his daughter on the front steps, the dropped charge that fixed nothing, the years of rebuilding from a position no one should have been forced into. She gave a single small nod, not a gesture of triumph, not the nod of someone who has completed a transaction. It was the nod of someone acknowledging that a thing which needed to happen has happened, and that the person standing across from them understands this too. Wendell exhaled. He looked down at the paper coffee cup in his hands, now cold, and he breathed for what felt like the first time since he had gotten on the bus that morning. Declan Ashford placed his hand on Renata's back as the last of the gallery cleared the corridor. She let herself lean into him for a moment, a small concession to exhaustion that she would not have made inside the courtroom or in any space where it could be observed by someone who needed to see her in a particular way. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm tired," she said. It was the first honest accounting of her physical state she had offered since the night before. Not angry, not triumphant. Tired in the deep way of a person who has been carrying something heavy for many hours and has only just been permitted to acknowledge its weight. "That's allowed. I have a 2 o'clock motion on the Kellerman case." "Renata." "I know." She straightened. "I'll eat lunch first." He put his hand against the side of her face for a moment. She closed her eyes. 3 seconds. Then she opened them, and she was again the Honorable Judge Ashford with a schedule in a courthouse and work that did not pause for what she was feeling. "There are people," she said, "whose names I know, and whose names nobody else in this building knows, who sat in that cell or a cell like it and came out the other side without a courtroom to walk into. This morning was for them too. It had to be." Declan looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who had spent his career in the company of precise, effective arguers, and he recognized when an argument was both correct and settled. "I know," he said. The investigation moved with a speed that surprised people who were accustomed to the pace at which institutions investigate themselves. This was not an institution investigating itself. This was Brennan Foxworth's office, which was specifically constituted to investigate institutions that could not be trusted to do it. And Foxworth ran his office the way Renata ran her courtroom, without sentiment and without tolerance for delay. The dashboard camera footage from Brackett's cruiser was recovered within 48 hours. The precinct's night sergeant had logged a technical malfunction in the system report filed at the end of the shift. Federal forensic technicians found no malfunction. They found the footage intact, a 14-minute recording that showed with the flat, indifferent clarity of a camera that has no stake in what it captures the entire encounter at the Texaco station on Route 9. It showed Renata standing at the pump. It showed the cruiser circling. It showed the conversation. It showed the grab and the slam and the cuffs being tightened by the hand that took them from Alderton's grip one deliberate notch beyond what policy permitted. It showed Renata's face pressed against the trunk of her own car, and it showed her voice captured by Brackett's lapel microphone, saying clearly, "I am not resisting. You are conducting an unlawful arrest." Brady's team entered the footage into the federal record. A copy was provided to Sable Morse at the Oak Falls Courier under a public records request filed this same afternoon. The footage ran on the paper's website that evening and had been viewed 200,000 times by the following morning. The same week, Brennan Foxworth made contact with Wendell Greer. A federal investigator knocked on the door of Wendell's apartment on the east side of Oak Falls on a Thursday morning and introduced himself and explained with the directness his office preferred that the investigation of Deputy Brackett had expanded to include prior incidents and that Wendell's case from 6 years ago had come to their attention through documents obtained in the course of the investigation. Wendell stood in his doorway in a work shirt and listened. "Alderton disclosed it," Foxworth said. "Stop the charge, the report. He has provided testimony that Brackett targeted you deliberately and that Captain Colburn was informed and altered the internal review to prevent formal sanction." Wendell was quiet for a moment. He looked past Foxworth at the street below, at the ordinary Thursday morning moving past on the sidewalk, the same street, the same ordinary motion as if nothing had changed. "I lost my job," Wendell said. "I lost my apartment. My daughter watched me get put in cuffs on the front steps." "I know," Foxworth said. "And it just disappeared. The charge went away and nothing happened to anybody. Would you be willing to testify?" Wendell looked at Foxworth. He thought about the courthouse bench. He thought about the nod across the corridor. "Yes," he said. Corbin Alderton's cooperation was complete and early. In his first interview with federal investigators conducted with his newly retained defense attorney present, Alderton disclosed everything. He disclosed the pattern of late shift stops, the targeting, the reports that were written to describe events that had not occurred, and the understanding never explicitly stated but thoroughly established over 2 years of working alongside Brackett, that Colburn would manage any complaints that resulted. He described the culture of the night shift, the jokes, the shorthand, the way certain officers talked about certain neighborhoods and certain kinds of people, and the way institutional silence around that talk had permitted it to calcify into operational practice. He disclosed 14 complaints. He could account for the specific circumstances of 11 of them from memory, because he had known about them, had heard them discussed, had understood what they meant, and had said nothing. He disclosed Wendell Greer's case. He had been a junior officer at the time, not yet partnered with Brackett, but he had heard the story told in the precinct break room as a kind of instructional anecdote, delivered with the casual authority of someone explaining how things actually work as opposed to how they are described in the training manual. He wept during parts of the interview. Foxworth's team noted it in the transcript and moved on. Alderton accepted a plea agreement. He resigned from law enforcement, permanently forfeited his pension, and was sentenced to 3 years of closely supervised probation with mandatory community service in a reentry program for formerly incarcerated individuals. The sentencing judge noted that the cooperation had been substantial and early, and that Alderton was 28 years old, and that the law permitted in specific circumstances the possibility of partial redemption. Alderton did not argue with any term of the agreement. He signed where he was asked to sign, and he did not look up. Colburn was charged separately, 8 years of administrative interference documented through the recovered files of every complaint that had been reviewed, altered, and closed on his authority constituted a case that did not require extensive construction. It was already built. Foxworth simply assembled what was there: 14 files, 14 altered reviews, 14 signatures, next to conclusions that the documentary evidence directly contradicted. Coburn was terminated his pension under criminal review and charged with multiple counts of misconduct in office and obstruction of an official investigation. His attorney argued that he had operated within the discretionary authority available to a commanding officer in managing personnel matters. The argument did not survive contact with the documents that showed him personally revising complaint narratives before filing them with the Oversight Board. The federal trial of Holden Brackett began 6 weeks after the morning in courtroom 302. The courthouse was a larger building than Oak Falls County, a federal facility with marble floors and higher ceilings, in the specific atmosphere of a place where the stakes have been elevated by jurisdiction. Brackett sat at the defense table in a gray suit that looked like it had been purchased under duress, his bearing diminished without the uniform that had been the primary architecture of his self-presentation for 8 years. His attorney, funded by the most aggressive faction of the Union, was a man named Carl Fenwick, who had spent 20 years arguing that the space between what an officer did and what the law permitted was always in the final analysis a judgment call made under pressure, and that 12 civilians could not retroactively second-guess the split-second decisions of trained professionals operating in conditions those civilians had never experienced. Fenwick's central argument in this case was qualified immunity, the legal doctrine that protects officers from civil liability for actions taken in the course of their official duties unless those actions violate clearly established law that a reasonable officer would have known. Fenwick argued that Brackett in the dark at an isolated gas station confronting a person dressed casually and behaving in a manner that he interpreted within his training and experience as suspicious had made a professional assessment in real time and acted on it. He argued that the fact the person turned out to be a judge was legally speaking irrelevant to the question of whether the officer had reason to believe his actions were lawful at the moment he took them. He was careful not to say out loud what the argument implied, which was that an officer's assessment of a person's power and social standing should determine how that person is treated under the law. He was careful because he understood that a jury in a federal courthouse would hear that implication clearly regardless of how it was phrased. Renata understood the argument. She had spent 11 years applying law that included this doctrine, and she knew its contours and its purposes and the specific legitimate reason it existed. She also knew precisely where it ended, and she had spent the week since the hearing preparing to say so from the witness stand. She took the stand in a tailored Navy suit. No robe. The robe was for her courtroom, and this was not her courtroom. Here she was a witness, and she would be exactly what the situation required, and nothing more. She testified for 40 minutes. She described the encounter at the pump in the specific sequential language of someone who had organized the events in their opinion and was communicating them accurately. She described the cruiser circling. She described the approach. She described each legal standard she had cited and why, and the basis for her confidence that those standards were correctly stated. She described the absence of any articulable basis for reasonable suspicion, the false claim of a reported burglary in the area, the escalation, the physical force, the deliberate over-tightening of the restraints. Then Carl Fenwick cross-examined her, and he was careful and professional, and he arrived at the point of his defense with the circling approach of an experienced litigator who knows that the route matters as much as the destination. Judge Ashford Fenwick said, "Isn't it true that at the time of this encounter, you were not visibly identifiable as a judicial officer?" "I was not." "You were dressed in casual clothes, not displaying any credentials or insignia of office." "Correct." And it is fair to say that Deputy Brackett had no way of knowing at the time he made his assessment that you held any particular professional position. "That's correct," Renata said. Fenwick let a beat go by. He turned slightly toward the jury box. "So the question before this court is whether Deputy Brackett's actions, assessed against the information available to him at the moment he acted, constituted a knowing violation of clearly established law that a reasonable officer would have recognized." "That is one way to frame the question," Renata said. Fenwick heard something in her voice. He looked back at her. The other way Rahafisha continued is to ask whether any citizen standing at a gas station engaged in no illegal activity possesses a clearly established constitutional right not to be physically assaulted when they accurately describe the limits of a police officer's authority. And the answer to that question does not depend on whether the citizen is a judge or an electrician or an unemployed 19-year-old in a hoodie. She held Fenwick's gaze without moving. My professional title did not create my constitutional rights. Those rights existed before I arrived at that pump. They existed for every person who had stood at that same pump before me, and they will exist long after I leave this stand. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. The verdict was unanimous on all counts. Federal Judge Beatrix Colburn had presided over many trials in her years on the federal bench, and she had developed the particular economy of expression of a person who has had many opportunities to say important things and has learned that the important things do not require embellishment. She looked down at Holden Breckett at the defense table. "Mr. Breckett," she said, "you were entrusted with authority that most people never hold and most people would exercise responsibly. You used it as a weapon against a person you believe could not fight back. The fact that you were wrong about that the specific person you chose to target happened to possess the means and the standing to hold you accountable, is not a mitigating factor in this proceeding. It is an indictment of every assumption that led you to believe such a target existed at all." She closed the folder in front of her. 4 years federal custody. The sound Breckett made was not a word. His attorney put a hand on his shoulder. The hand was not comfort. It was the gesture of someone acknowledging that a process has concluded and that there is nothing further to be done by either of them in this room. Wendell Greer was in the gallery. He had taken the bus from Oak Falls that morning and arrived before the doors opened and sat in the third row with the patience of a man accustomed to waiting for things that matter to him. He had listened to the testimony and the closing arguments in the jury instructions with the full attention of a person who has a specific personal stake in the outcome of a proceeding. When the verdict was announced, he did not make a sound and he did not move. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, and he felt something that was not quite the word satisfied, because satisfied implied that the outcome had restored what was lost, and it had not restored the job or the 2 years or his daughter's memory of the handcuffs on the front steps of their building. But it was something real. It was something he had stopped believing was possible during the years when the complaint was filed and reviewed and closed, and Breckett went back to his shift without consequence. It was the system doing the thing that it was supposed to do and had failed for 8 years to do. He thought that was worth the bus fare. Wendell had agreed to testify in the federal case, and he had done so. He had sat in the witness box in a federal courthouse and described the Tuesday evening on the east side of Oak Falls in the plain, unembellished language of a man who has had 6 years to decide exactly how he wants to tell the story of the worst night of his life. He described the stop. He described the charge. He described his daughter. He described what the dropped charge had not undone. He had not cried on the stand. He had simply told the truth, and the truth spoken in that room with that clarity had been heavier than any dramatic delivery could have made it. 3 weeks after sentencing, Renata received a call from Brennan Foxworth's office. The Oak Falls County Commissioners, under substantial political pressure and with the explicit encouragement of the state attorney general, had agreed to establish a civilian oversight board for the precinct. They were looking for board members with relevant experience in law community advocacy or direct personal experience with the department. Foxworth asked if she knew anyone who might be appropriate. She gave him Wendell Greer's number. Wendell accepted the appointment. He attended his first board meeting on a Tuesday evening in November in a conference room on the second floor of the Oak Falls County Municipal Building. He sat at a table with a public health administrator, a retired school principal, 2 attorneys, and a former corrections officer who had spent 15 years advocating for prison reform. They were given binders containing the department's complaint procedures, use of force policies, and the documentation from the past 8 years that the Foxworth investigation had made part of the public record. They were given for the first time in the history of this particular precinct actual authority to review complaint files, compel officer testimony, and issue binding recommendations. Wendell looked around the table at the beginning of that first meeting and thought about the bench outside courtroom 302. About the bus ride to a courthouse he had not expected to leave feeling anything other than what he had arrived feeling, which was the particular exhaustion of a person who has tried for years to believe that accountability is possible and has found limited evidence for it. The evidence he thought was somewhat better now. The mandatory body camera compliance went into effect across Oak Falls County in January. The constitutional law training for all active duty officers was scheduled and fully staffed. The county administrator sent a written directive to every officer in the department that used precise, unambiguous language. The rights of a citizen do not vary with their appearance, their address, or their choice of clothing at any hour of the day or night. Judge Lavinia Wentworth called Renata 3 weeks after the federal verdict. Renata was in her office when the call came in reviewing a sentencing memo in an unrelated case. She picked up, and Wentworth was quiet for a moment before speaking the silence of a person choosing their words with care. "I watched the footage," Wentworth said. "The camera footage from the cruiser." Renata waited. "I've been thinking about what you said at the conference," Wentworth continued, "about the difference between the law and its application. I think I've been conflating the two for longer than I'd like to admit. It was not an apology precisely. It was something more difficult than an apology, a person revising a position they had held for a long time in the presence of someone who had told them it needed revising." Renata recognized the cost of it. "Come to Oak Falls sometime," Renata said. "I'll show you the court." Wentworth said she would. Renata set the phone down and returned to the sentencing memo. The case involved a young man named Tyler Oakes, 22 years old. First offense possession, and she was looking at the circumstances of the arrest and asking the same questions she always asked: whether each procedural threshold had been met, whether each documented decision had been made lawfully, whether the record before her described what actually happened or what someone had decided it was convenient to say happened. The questions were the same questions she had always asked. They felt different now, not in the logic of them, in the weight. She finished the memo and set it in the out tray and looked at her office at the shelves of case law and procedural guides, at the framed certificate of admission to the bar from 30 years ago, at the small whiteboard on the wall where she wrote the names of cases she was actively considering so she could see them all at once. She opened her desk drawer and took out the small leather notebook. She turned the pages slowly. Marcus Webb, Tiara Hollins, a dozen other names, their cases summarized in her narrow handwriting in the margins beside each one. She found Wendell Greer's name near the bottom of a page dated 6 years back. She read the 3 lines she had written at the time, the notes of a public defender who knew she had won the legal battle and was not sure she had won anything else. Charges dropped, stop unconstitutional, client loss of employment ongoing. Systemic follow-up needed. Systemic follow-up needed. 6 years it had taken. 48 hours in the cold and the bureaucratic dark. A night in a holding cell with wrists that were still in quiet moments, sensitive to the pressure of certain angles. A morning in a courtroom where the weight of what she knew sat across from the weight of what they thought they knew, and her patience had outlasted their arrogance. She took the pen from the desk and placed a small mark beside Wendell's name, not crossing it out, not closing it. A mark that meant seen, a mark that meant the system had, in this case and on this timeline, and with enormous cost, done the thing it was designed to do. She put the notebook back in the drawer. Outside the window, Hartford moved through a November afternoon in its ordinary way, the traffic and the pedestrians and the sky going gray, with the particular gray of a New England winter that is still technically autumn. She watched it for a moment. The unremarkable daily motion of a city that had not noticed what had happened in a courthouse, in a federal facility, in a boardroom, and on a bus, the accumulation of small, deliberate acts that had moved slowly and imperfectly and with enormous friction in the direction of what the law was supposed to be. She thought about Route 9, about the dark stretch of highway and the flickering Texaco sign and the amber fuel light on her dashboard. She thought about standing at the pump in her scuffed shoes with the cold on her face and the silence of the empty lot around her. She thought about the moment the cruiser circled, slow and deliberate, and she thought about what she had known in that moment, which was that something was already in motion, and that the only question was whether she would meet it with fear or with the particular clarity that comes from knowing exactly what you believe and why. If she had known what that circle meant for the 12 hours that followed, she would not have changed anything. She would have been standing at that pump. She would have cited the same legal standards in the same steady voice. She would have stayed silent in the back of the cruiser and in the cold of cell 3 and in the booking room and through all of it, because the silence had not been surrender. It had been the most precise, the most legally sound, The most consequential thing that she had ever done in a career built on precision, and she had done it not for herself, though she had needed to do it for herself, but for every name in the notebook and every name she would never know. Power does not announce itself. It does not arrive wearing its credentials. It is present in the 19-year-old on the street corner and the woman at the gas pump and the maintenance supervisor standing on his front steps. It is present because the law says it is present, and the law says it is present because people like her have spent their careers insisting that the sentence means what it says and applies to everyone equally without condition and without exception. She had spent one night in a holding cell learning what it costs when it does not. She was going to spend the rest of her career making sure fewer people paid that cost. She straightened the memo in the out tray. She looked at the whiteboard. She looked at the afternoon light fading over Hartford. She picked up the next file. The weeks between the morning in courtroom 302 and the beginning of the federal trial had a particular texture. Renata continued to preside over her docket. She continued to hear motions rule on evidence and manage the daily administrative reality of a busy district court. People who appeared before her noticed nothing different. The same precision, the same impartiality, the same refusal to be rushed or deflected or softened by the performance of the attorneys before her. What was different was visible only to people who knew her well, and primarily to Declan. She was more deliberate in her reading of police reports. Not suspicious, not adversarial, but slow in the way of someone who has recently been reminded that a document is not a neutral object. It is a choice about which version of events becomes the official version, and whoever makes that choice holds a power that is not always acknowledged. She had always known this. She now knew it in her wrists, in the fading bruises she looked at each morning for 2 weeks before they disappeared. And the knowing in the body is different from the knowing in the mind. She had asked Foxworth during one of their briefing calls whether the 3 additional cases he had identified at the end of that first morning would result in charges against Breckett. 2 of them, Foxworth told her, would be included in the federal indictment as pattern evidence. The third was older outside the statute of limitations for criminal charges, but the individuals involved had been connected with civil rights attorneys, and the cases were proceeding on a civil track. She had asked whether those individuals knew yet that the case had moved. Foxworth said they were being notified that week. Renata had thought about that for a long time after the call ended. The people in those files had been carrying the weight of what had been done to them, some of them for years without resolution and without acknowledgement. They had filed complaints that went nowhere. They had watched the officer who stopped them continue working, continue appearing in court, continue being treated as a credible witness. They had been told by the outcome of their complaints that what they said happened was not considered reliable enough to act upon. What had changed was not the fact of what Breckett had done. The fact had always been the fact. What had changed was who was attached to it. She was aware of this. She sat with it. The system had moved when it moved because she was the victim, not because the pattern was new or the evidence was suddenly more compelling than it had been across 14 prior complaints. The evidence had always been there. The pattern had always been there. The system had moved because the specific person at the center of this incident had the particular institutional standing to bring the machinery of accountability into motion. This was the thing she could not let herself look away from, because looking away from it was the beginning of the error that had made it possible in the first place. The error of believing that the protection of rights was reliably proportional to the deserving of them rather than to the power of the person whose rights had been violated. She wrote this down in the notebook beneath the names, not because it was a new insight, because writing it down was a commitment to carrying it, to letting it sit in the same pages as Marcus Webb and Tierra Hollins and Wendell Greer and all the names that represented people the system had moved slowly for or not moved for at all. She wanted the insight adjacent to the names so that the abstraction stayed tethered to the specific. The specific mattered. The specific was the whole point. On the evening after the federal sentencing, Declan opened a bottle of wine from the rack in the kitchen and poured 2 glasses and brought them to the living room where Renata was sitting in the armchair nearest the window reading. She took the glass and he sat across from her on the sofa, and they were quiet for a moment in the comfortable silence of people who have been in the same rooms long enough that silence does not require explanation. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about the question. She gave it the consideration it deserved rather than reaching for the first available answer. "Like something that needed to happen has happened," she said. And like there are 400 more things that need to happen, and I have one judge's worth of capacity to work on them. Declan nodded. He had been married to her for 22 years. He knew what this meant, that she would spend the one judge's worth of capacity as completely as she could, and that this would not feel to her like sacrifice because it was not sacrifice. It was what she was for. Wendell Greer called me today, she said. Declan looked up. He wanted to say thank you. She paused. I told him I hadn't done him any favors. I told him I'd done what I should have done 6 years ago, when his complaint was filed and had the documentation to support it and went nowhere because the system it entered was designed and practiced to protect the officer rather than the citizen. He disagreed with me on that. He was probably right to disagree. He was. She looked at the window. That doesn't mean I wasn't also right. Declan raised his glass slightly. She raised hers. They drank. Outside Hartford was doing what Hartford does in November, which is to become the kind of place that insists on being exactly what it is without apology or ornament. The cold was real, and the streets were real, and the courthouse at the center of the city was real with its marble floors and its high ceilings and its docket that would begin again at 9 in the morning and would contain, as it always contained, cases in which a person's life moved in one direction or another depending on how well the law was applied. Renata set her wineglass on the side table. She picked up her book. She read 3 pages and set it down again and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then she got up and went to the kitchen and made a cup of tea and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the November dark and thought about Route 9, about the amber light on the dashboard, about the moment she had heard the V8 idle and seen the cruiser begin its deliberate circle. She thought about the choice she had made in that moment not to reach for her wallet and produce the badge and end it before it began. She had made that choice knowing that ending it that way would mean Breckett returned to the shift the next night with the lesson confirmed that he could do what he did without consequence. She had made it knowing what it was going to cost her for the next several hours. She had made it because she had a name in her notebook, and the name had cost its owner everything. And the mechanism that had made that possible was still running. And someone who had the standing to stop it was standing at a gas pump at midnight with a credit card and a full tank and a choice to make. She drank her tea, she washed the cup, she went to bed. In the morning, she would pick up the next file.